The final notes of the waltz had faded into memory nearly 20 minutes ago, and Georgiana Fairfax stood frozen in the center of the Tilney ballroom, watching the last of the guests depart into the November fog, their carriage lamps disappearing like dying stars into the thick London night. And with each vanishing light, she felt the cold reality of her situation settle over her shoulders like a shroud. The grand ballroom that had blazed with 1,000 candles just an hour before was now surrendering to shadow as servants moved systematically through the space, extinguishing tapers with practiced efficiency, their long brass snuffers creating small wisps of smoke that curled upward into the ornate plasterwork ceiling where cherubs and classical figures now watched her predicament with unseeing eyes. She had been abandoned, left behind like a forgotten glove or misplaced fan, and the shame of it made her throat tight, even as she fought to maintain the composure that 6 years as a paid companion had taught her was her only armor against the world's casual cruelties. The Dowager Countess of Pemberton had taken ill suddenly during supper, her elderly heart fluttering in that frightening way that sent her physician into urgent whispers, and her lady's maid into immediate action. And in the flurry of departure, everyone had simply assumed that Georgiana had accompanied her employer, as she always did, as invisible and necessary as the dowager's shawl or walking stick. But Georgiana had been in the retiring room when the carriage was called, attempting to repair a torn hem on her grey silk gown, the practical dress of a companion that now felt less like appropriate attire, and more like a costume marking her as something neither servant nor lady, belonging nowhere and to no one. Through the tall windows she could see the last carriage pulling away, its lamps swaying as the horses navigated the fog-obscured street, and she pressed one trembling hand against the cool glass, as though she might call it back through sheer force of will. The November chill was seeping through the terrace doors someone had left slightly ajar, making the remaining candle florlums dance and gutter, and she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off cold that came as much from within as without. Her reticule hung from her wrist, a small beaded thing that had been her mother's, and she opened it with shaking fingers to count the few coins inside, knowing even as she did so that they would not be enough for a hackney to carry her all the way to her modest lodgings in Bloomsbury, not at this hour when drivers charged extra for the fog and the darkness and the danger of London's midnight streets. She had perhaps enough for half the journey, which meant she would have to walk the rest, alone, through streets where no respectable woman ventured unescorted after dark, and the thought made her stomach clench with fear she could not quite suppress. A footman approached her then, one of the younger ones whose name she did not know, and his expression held that particular blend of pity and condescension that servants reserved for those whose status was ambiguous, neither fish nor fowl, ladies by birth, but employees by necessity. "Begging your pardon, miss, but the family is retiring," he said, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes revealing that he knew exactly what she was. A paid companion, someone who existed in the margins of society's grand pageant. "Were you not with the dowager's party?" he continued, and she heard in his question the unspoken judgment, the assumption that someone like her should have been more careful, more attentive, less likely to be forgotten. "Yes, she began, then stopped, hating the tremor in her voice. "There's been a misunderstanding. I shall wait here a moment, if I may, until I can arrange, that is." She could not finish the sentence because she had no idea how to finish it, no plan beyond hoping that somehow the situations would resolve itself through some miracle she could not envision. "The house will be locked shortly, miss," the footman said, his discomfort now evident in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, for security. The words hung in the air between them, a polite dismissal that nonetheless made clear she could not remain here indefinitely, that even in her predicament she was an inconvenience to be managed and moved along. "I understand," she said quietly, summoning every ounce of dignity her genteel upbringing had instilled in her. "I shall not be long." The footman nodded and retreated, clearly relieved to be released from the awkward encounter, and she watched him go before turning toward a shadowed alcove near the terrace doors where the damask wallpaper in shades of grey and cream would render her nearly invisible in her grey gown. She pressed herself into the corner, her back against the silk-covered wall, and tried to think through her options with the clarity that had sustained her through 6 years of impossible situations. 6 years since her father's death had left her penniless, his investments in railway schemes having proved as insubstantial as morning mist, his debts consuming everything they owned, including the modest house in Hampshire, where she had grown up reading Wordsworth in the garden and imagining a future that looked nothing like this present. She had been 22 then, educated and gently bred, but trained for nothing except marriage to a gentleman of moderate means and the running of a household she would now never have. And when the creditors had taken everything she had sold, even her mother's jewelry, to pay for her father's funeral, and found herself alone in the world with no family willing to claim a penniless relation. Companion work had been her only option, the only respectable employment for a woman of her class, and she had learned quickly to make herself useful and invisible in equal measure, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, fade into the background of drawing-rooms and ballrooms alike. This ball tonight had been the first she had attended in years, the dowager having insisted with uncharacteristic kindness that Georgiana should come, should have one evening of pleasure instead of sitting alone in her small room reading by candlelight. And there had been pleasure, she acknowledged, even as she stood now in the shadows counting the cost of that brief joy. The Duke of Ashford had asked her to dance, had walked directly to where she sat alone on a gilt chair, watching the swirl of silks and jewels, and had extended his hand with a slight bow that suggested he saw her as a lady rather than a paid appendage to his aunt's friend. The waltz had been, she allowed herself to remember, magical in the way that word suggested, his hand warm and sure at her waist, his conversation intelligent and surprisingly lacking in the condescension she had expected from a man of his rank. They had spoken of Wordsworth, of all things, and he had quoted lines from Tintern Abbey with an accuracy that suggested genuine familiarity rather than rote memorization for social polish. And for those few minutes she had felt seen in a way she had not experienced since before her father's death. But that had been then, when the ballroom blazed with light and possibility, and this was now, with shadows lengthening across the parquet floor and the scent of dying flowers and spent beeswax candles filling the cooling air. The long case clock in the corner struck the half-hour, its sonorous chime marking midnight, and she counted each tone like a prisoner marking time, wondering how long until dawn when she might slip away with some remnant of dignity intact. The servant's footsteps echoed in the vastness of the emptying house, a counterpoint to the clock's steady tick, and somewhere in the distance she heard a door close with a finality that made her flinch. The fog pressed against the windows like something alive, obscuring the street beyond until London itself seemed to have vanished, leaving her alone in this vasted cold space that had been transformed from a place of music and light into something that felt increasingly like a trap. She thought of her small room in Bloomsbury, barely large enough for a bed and washstand, but it was hers, the one place in the world where she could close a door and be simply Georgiana rather than Miss Fairfax the companion. And the longing for that refuge was so intense it was almost physical. But between here and there lay miles of fog-shrouded streets, and she had no means to traverse them safely, and so she remained pressed into her alcove like a ghost haunting the margins of a world that had never quite made room for women like her, women who had fallen between the cracks of class and circumstance, too educated to be servants, but too poor to be ladies, existing in a liminal space that society preferred not to acknowledge. The terrace doors rattled slightly in a gust of wind, and she pulled her arms tighter around herself, feeling the cold seep through the thin silk of her gown, and wondered how it was possible to feel so alone in a city of millions, how abandonment could be both a physical fact and a metaphorical truth that had defined her entire adult life. She closed her eyes against the sting of tears she would not permit herself to shed. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw again the Duke's face as they waltzed, the way he had looked at her as though she mattered, as though her thoughts and words had value beyond their utility to someone else's comfort. And she knew with a certainty that bordered on despair that she would remember this night for the rest of her life. This night when she had been briefly visible before being forgotten once more. Sebastian Whitmore, Duke of Ashford, pushed through the main doors of the Tilney residence at 1:15 in the morning, startling the elderly butler who had been in the process of turning the heavy brass key in the lock, and the look of surprise on the servant's face would have been comical under other circumstances. But Sebastian was too preoccupied with his own confused motivations to notice much beyond the fact that he had gained entry. "Your Grace," the butler stammered, "we thought all the guests had departed. Is there something amiss?" And Sebastian waved away the concern with a gesture that he hoped conveyed more certainty than he felt. "My mother's fan," he said, the lie coming easily because he had practiced it during the carriage ride back. "She believes she may have left it in the ballroom, and I offered to retrieve it rather than trouble your household in the morning." The butler nodded, clearly relieved to have a reasonable explanation for this irregular return, and stepped aside to allow the Duke passage, though Sebastian could feel the man's curious gaze following him as he strode toward the ballroom with a purposefulness that masked the fact that he had no idea what he was actually doing here. The truth, which he had been avoiding examining too closely during the past hour, was that he had left the ball, climbed into his carriage, returned to his townhouse in Mayfair, dismissed his valet, poured himself a brandy, and found himself utterly unable to think about anything except Miss Georgiana Fairfax and the conversation they had shared during their waltz. He had replayed every word, every subtle shift of expression on her intelligent face, the way she had quoted Wordsworth with an accuracy that suggested genuine love of poetry rather than mere social accomplishment. And the more he thought about her, the more he realized that he could not remember the last time he had spoken with someone who seemed interested in his thoughts rather than his title. The parade of simpering debutantes and their ambitious mothers had become so tedious that he had begun to dread the social season, each ball a repetition of the last, each conversation as empty as the one before, and he had felt himself becoming as cold and distant as his father had been. That frightening transformation from man to marble statue, that seemed the inevitable fate of dukes who had no one to truly see them. But Georgiana had seen him, or at least she had looked at him as though he were Sebastian rather than the Duke of Ashford, and that small distinction had haunted him through the fog-shrouded streets until he had finally acknowledged to himself that he needed to see her again, to confirm that the connection he felt had been real, and not merely the product of too much champagne and his own loneliness. So he had invented the excuse about the fan, climbed back into his carriage, and returned to the Tilney residence with no clear plan beyond perhaps asking if he might call on her, though even as he formulated that thought he realized he had no idea where a paid companion might receive callers or if such a thing was even done. The ballroom stretched before him in deep shadow, the vast space transformed by darkness into something almost unrecognizable, and only 2 candelabras still burned, one near the entrance and one by the far windows, creating pools of golden light that made the emptiness between them seem deeper and more profound. He paused just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust, and that was when he saw her, a slight figure silhouetted against the window, her face turned toward the fog-obscured street, as though she were waiting for something that would never arrive. For a moment he simply stared, confusion giving way to concern as he realized that she was still here, alone, nearly an hour after the ball had ended, and the wrongness of it made something tighten in his chest. "Miss Fairfax," he said, his voice carrying in the empty space and making her start violently. "What the devil?" And then he caught himself, remembering his manners even as alarm overrode propriety. "Forgive me, why are you still here?" She turned to face him, and rose from the window seat with a composure that would have been admirable if he had not noticed the way her hands trembled as she smoothed down her skirts, the grey silk of her gown making her seem almost spectral in the dim light. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, even if her hands were not. "I apologize for the intrusion. There was a misunderstanding with the Dowager's carriage, and I find myself temporarily delayed." The words were carefully chosen, he noticed, designed to minimize the situation, to make it seem manageable when clearly it was anything but. And he moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he tried to understand what she was actually telling him. "Delayed," he repeated, glancing toward the long case clock that showed the time as nearly 2 in the morning. "It's nearly 2 in the morning. Where is your chaperone? Your family?" She met his eyes then, and he saw in her face a pride that refused to crumble even in the face of what must be a humiliating situation. "I have neither, Your Grace," she said with quiet precision. "I am the Dowager's companion. My situation is temporary but manageable. I shall arrange for a hackney shortly." The words struck him with the force of revelation, not because they told him anything he had not already known about her employment, but because they made clear just how alone she truly was, and the image of her attempting to secure transportation at this hour. Alone, through streets thick with fog and God knew what else, made his jaw tighten with an anger that surprised him with its intensity. "At this hour," he said sharply. "Alone. Through streets thick with fog and worse, absolutely not." He saw her spine stiffen at his tone, that reflexive pride of someone who had learned to guard her dignity because it was the only thing she had left to guard. "I have little choice in the matter," she said, "but I thank you for your concern." The formality of her response, the careful distance she was trying to maintain, only made him more aware of how vulnerable her position truly was, and he realized with a clarity that cut through all his confusion about why he had returned that he could not, would not leave her here to face whatever consequences the night might bring. He took another step closer, close enough now to see that she was shivering, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to ward off the cold that seeped through the terrace doors someone had neglected to fully close, and without thinking about propriety or protocol. He shrugged out of his evening coat and moved to drape it around her shoulders. "You have more choice than you realize, Miss Fairfax," he said, his voice gentler now. "But first you are freezing. Take my coat." She looked up at him with an expression he could not quite read, something between gratitude and wariness, and he saw her throat move as she swallowed hard before speaking. "Your Grace, this is—" she began, but he cut her off with a slight shake of his head. "Sebastian," he said, "if we are to spend any length of time in conversation, you might as well use my given name, and I suspect we do need to have a rather serious conversation about your current predicament and how we might resolve it without causing a scandal that would harm us both." He saw understanding dawn in her eyes, the realization that his presence here with her, alone, in the middle of the night, was itself potentially ruinous, and he watched her calculate the implications with a speed that confirmed his earlier impression of her intelligence. She pulled his coat more tightly around herself, and he caught the scent of lavender water, simple and clean, nothing like the heavy perfumes the debutantes favored. "I did not ask you to return," she said carefully. "I would not have you compromise yourself on my account." The statement revealed so much about her character, her immediate concern for his reputation rather than her own welfare, and Sebastian felt something shift in his chest, that same recognition he had experienced during their waltz, the sense that he was in the presence of someone fundamentally different from everyone else in his social sphere. "My reputation can withstand considerably more than yours," he said bluntly. "I am a duke and a man. Society forgives us almost anything, but you are a woman alone, and if anyone discovers that you spent the night, however innocently, in a situation that could be construed as compromising, you will be the one who suffers." She flinched slightly at his frank assessment, and he regretted the harshness of his words, even as he recognized their truth. He glanced toward the windows where moonlight was beginning to filter through the thinning fog, creating silver patches on the parquet floor that shifted and changed as clouds moved across the scum. The candle flames in the candelabras danced in a draught from the terrace doors, casting shadows that made the vast ballroom seem to pulse with a life of its own, and in the distance he could hear the butler's keys jingling as the man went about his nightly rounds. Each sound amplified by the emptiness until even the ticking of the clock seemed oppressively loud, marking each passing moment of impropriety. Sebastian looked back at Georgiana, taking in the exhaustion visible in the set of her shoulders despite her upright posture, the way she held herself together through sheer force of will, and he made a decision that he suspected would alter the course of both their lives in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. He had come back here tonight, following an impulse he had not entirely understood, drawn by a conversation that had lasted perhaps 15 minutes, but had somehow managed to reach through the wall of isolation he had built around himself over years of performing the role society expected. She had quoted Wordsworth with passion in her voice, had disagreed with him about the relative merits of the lyrical ballads versus the later work, had made him laugh with a dry observation about the absurdity of social pretensions, and he had found himself wanting to continue that conversation, to explore the mind behind those perceptive eyes. And now here she was, abandoned and alone, and he discovered that he could not bear the thought of walking away and leaving her to whatever fate the cruel machinery of society might decree. The fog pressed against the windows like something alive, isolating them from the world beyond, and Sebastian realized that this moment, suspended between night and dawn, was its own kind of liminal space, where the usual rules might be bent, if not broken entirely. He thought of his empty townhouse with its 20 bedrooms and army of servants, the vast loneliness of being the Duke of Ashford, with no one to truly talk to, and he thought of this woman before him who had spent 6 years making herself invisible so that others might be comfortable, and he knew with a certainty that defied logic that he was not going to let her disappear back into the shadows. "What if," he said slowly, testing the idea even as he spoke it, "what if we simply waited here until dawn, when I can arrange proper transportation for you without raising questions that neither of us can afford to answer?" She stared at him as though he had suggested something wildly improper, which he supposed in a sense he had, but he pressed on before she could voice the obvious objections. "The servants believe I am here searching for my mother's fan," he continued. "If we remain quiet and out of sight, if we simply wait a few hours until daylight makes everything easier to manage, then you can leave with your reputation intact, and no one need know that you were ever in a difficult situation." He watched her face as she processed this proposal, saw the war between hope and caution playing out in her expression, and he waited, his own heart beating faster than the situation warranted, for her answer. "And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Sebastian watched Georgiana's face in the flickering candlelight as she considered his proposal to wait until dawn, and he saw the moment she made her decision. A slight relaxation in her shoulders that told him she had accepted the logic of his plan, even if propriety screamed against it. And without waiting for her verbal agreement, he moved to dismiss the butler with instructions that the Duke would lock up himself after retrieving his mother's fan, a statement that raised the elderly servant's eyebrows, but could not be questioned, given the speaker's rank. The sound of the butler's retreating footsteps echoed through the vast ballroom, followed by the distant click of a door closing, and then they were truly alone, suspended in a bubble of candlelight and shadow, while fog pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. And Sebastian found himself acutely aware of how irregular this situation was, and yet how strangely right it felt. He moved to the window seat where she had been sitting earlier, and began arranging the velvet cushions into something approximating comfort, creating a makeshift refuge where they might pass the hours until daylight made everything simpler. And as he worked, he was conscious of her watching him with an expression that mingled wariness with something that might have been hope. "I am going to retrieve some brandy from the refreshment room," he said, keeping his voice matter-of-fact to counteract the intimacy of their situation. "For warmth, you understand. The temperature is dropping, and we have several hours to wait." She nodded, still clutching his coat around her shoulders, and he left her there while he navigated the darkened house to find the room where the Tilneys had set out refreshments earlier in the evening, returning with a crystal decanter and 2 glasses that caught the candlelight as he poured generous measures for them both. Georgiana accepted the glass with hands that had stopped trembling quite so noticeably, and he watched as she took a small sip, her eyes widening slightly at the burn of the expensive French brandy, and he found himself smiling at her reaction before settling onto the window seat, a careful distance from her, close enough for conversation but far enough to maintain some semblance of propriety. For several minutes they sat in silence, both acutely aware of the strangeness of their situation, the vast ballroom stretching away into shadow behind them, while before them the fog-obscured London streets remained invisible. And Sebastian searched for something to say that would ease the tension without making it worse. The brandy helped, warming them both from within, and gradually he saw Georgiana's posture begin to relax, the rigid control she maintained over herself loosening degree by degree until she no longer looked quite so much like a woman expecting disaster at any moment. "You quoted Wordsworth during our waltz," he said finally, breaking the silence with the first neutral topic that came to mind. "The lines from Tintern Abbey about nature and memory. Do you read much poetry?" Her face transformed when she smiled, he noticed, the careful blankness she wore like armor giving way to something alive and engaged, and she nodded before speaking. "My father was a scholar," she said. "He had a library of nearly 2,000 volumes, philosophy and poetry mostly, and he taught me to read them all. He did not believe that women should be kept ignorant simply because society preferred us ornamental." Sebastian heard the past tense, the slight catch in her voice when she mentioned her father, and he filed away the information for later exploration while keeping the conversation on safer ground. "I read philosophy late at night when I cannot sleep," he admitted, a confession he would never have made in a London drawing room where such admissions would be seen as eccentric at best. Kant and Hume, mostly, trying to find some framework that makes sense of duty and meaning and the gulf between them. She looked at him with surprise that she did not quite manage to hide, and he realized that she had not expected a duke to admit to reading anything more challenging than the Times, and the realization made him laugh, a short, bitter sound that held more truth than humor. "You see," he said, "we are both more than society allows us to be. You are a woman with a scholar's mind forced to pretend that your greatest accomplishment is needlework, and I am a man who reads philosophy imprisoned in a role that demands I care only about voting records and marriage alliances. Do you know what it is like?" she said, leaning forward slightly in her intensity to be simultaneously too visible and entirely unseen, As a companion, I am present at every social function, yet no one truly looks at me. I am furniture that occasionally speaks." Her words struck him with unexpected force, because they articulated something he had felt, but never been able to name, and he found himself nodding before he spoke. "I understand more than you might think," he said, meeting her eyes in the candlelight. "I am perpetually visible, every action scrutinized, every word weighted for political meaning, yet no one sees me. They see the Duke of Ashford, the title, the fortune, the voting power in Parliament. The man beneath might as well be invisible." Georgiana's expression softened, and she spoke so quietly he had to lean closer to hear her. "Then we are both ghosts haunting society's ballrooms." "Until tonight," he said, and he was aware, as he spoke, that he was crossing some invisible line, moving from polite conversation into dangerous honesty. "I see you, Georgiana, truly see you, your intelligence, your dignity, the kindness you showed the Tilney daughter when she spilled wine on your dress. You told her it was already stained to spare her embarrassment." She stared at him with something like wonder in her eyes. "You noticed that?" she said, and it was not quite a question. "I notice everything about you," he admitted. "I have since the moment you entered the ballroom." The silence that followed his words felt charged with possibility, and Sebastian found himself loosening his cravat, an informality he would never normally permit himself, but which felt necessary in this strange suspended space they had created, and he saw her eyes follow the movement of his hands with an awareness that made his pulse quicken. The hours began to pass with a fluidity that surprised them both, conversation flowing from one topic to another with an ease that neither had experienced in years, and gradually the careful distance they had maintained began to collapse as they shifted position on the window seat, shoulders nearly touching, their voices growing softer as though loud speech might break whatever spell held them. Sebastian poured more brandy, and Georgiana accepted it without the hesitation she had shown earlier, and as the decanter caught the candlelight in amber glows, she told him about her father's financial ruin, the railway schemes that had promised fortune but delivered only debt, the slow, painful decline as everything they owned was sold to satisfy creditors, the final illness she had nursed alone because there was no money for proper help. "I was 22 when he died," she said, staring into her glass rather than at Sebastian, "trained for nothing but marriage to a gentleman of moderate means and the management of a household I would never have. Companion work was my only option, the only respectable employment for a woman of my class." Sebastian felt anger kindle in his chest, not at her, but at the system that created such limited options, that took an intelligent, educated woman and forced her to live half a life in the shadows of others' comfort. "Why did you never marry?" he asked, then immediately apologized. "Forgive the impertinence, but you are educated, well-bred." She interrupted him gently, her voice carrying the flat calm of someone who had made peace with painful truth. "I am nearly 30, Your Grace, Sebastian. I have no fortune, no family, no prospects. I have made peace with my circumstances." "Have you?" he said, leaning closer to study her face in the candlelight. "Because you do not seem at peace. You seem like a woman holding herself so tightly controlled that one genuine touch might shatter you." Her eyes met his, and he saw vulnerability there that made his breath catch. "And if I shattered?" she asked. "What then? I cannot afford the luxury of falling apart. I have no safety net, no one to catch me." "Perhaps you do now," he said quietly, and he reached out to steady her arm as she shifted position, his hand warm against the silk of her sleeve, and neither of them moved to break the contact. The clock ticked toward 3 in the morning, then 4, and the candles burned lower in their holders, creating dancing shadows on the ornate ceiling above them, while they talked about things Sebastian had never discussed with anyone: his mother's death when he was 12, the way his father had forbidden him to cry at the funeral because dukes do not show weakness, the years of learning to suppress every genuine feeling until he barely recognized himself anymore. My father was not cruel in the obvious ways, he said, staring out at the fog that still pressed against the windows. He simply had no capacity for warmth, no ability to see his children as anything but extensions of the Ashford name and legacy. And I have spent my entire adult life terrified that I would become him, cold and distant, and incapable of true connection. Georgiana's hand found his in the shadows between them, her fingers lacing through his with a boldness that surprised them both, and she spoke with fierce certainty. "You are not him," she said. "You came back tonight. You noticed when a companion showed kindness to an embarrassed girl. You read philosophy searching for meaning. You are nothing like the man you describe." Sebastian looked down at their joined hands, at the way her slender fingers fit against his larger ones, and felt something crack open in his chest. Some wall he had built so long ago he had forgotten it was there. They discovered more shared ground as the night deepened toward dawn. Both had lost their mothers young. Both felt trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Both had learned to perform roles that had nothing to do with their true selves. And with each revelation, the distance between them decreased until Sebastian could smell the lavender water she wore, could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes when the candlelight hit them just right. Georgiana laughed at something he said, a real unguarded sound that transformed her face, and Sebastian found himself watching her with a fascination he made no attempt to hide, memorizing the way expression animated her features, the intelligence that sparked in her eyes when she debated a point about Wordsworth's later work versus the lyrical ballads. She had opinions, strong ones, and she defended them with logical arguments that made him work to counter them, and he realized with something like shock that this was what he had been missing. Not just conversation, but intellectual engagement, someone who challenged him and made him think rather than simply agreeing with everything he said because of his rank. The brandy decanter stood nearly empty between them, and Sebastian's coat had slipped from Georgiana's shoulders to pool forgotten behind her, and the formality with which they had begun the evening had evaporated entirely, replaced by first names and shared confidences, and a physical proximity that would have been scandalous if anyone had been there to witness it. "I have been invisible for 6 years," Georgiana admitted as the clock struck 4, her voice barely above a whisper, present but unseen, useful but unvalued, and I thought I had accepted it, thought I had made my peace with being a ghost. But then you asked me to waltz, and you looked at me as though I mattered, and I realized I had not made peace at all. I had simply stopped hoping. Sebastian's hand tightened on hers, and he found himself speaking words he had not planned, had not even known he was thinking. "You matter," he said, "not because of what you can do for someone else, but because of who you are. Your mind, your spirit, your courage in facing circumstances that would have broken someone with less strength." She was crying now, silent tears tracking down her face in the candlelight, and he reached up with his free hand to brush them away, his thumb gentle against her cheek, and she leaned into his touch with a small sound that might have been relief or surrender. The fog outside had begun to thin slightly, and through the windows Sebastian could see the first hint of grey that suggested dawn was approaching, and he knew that soon they would have to leave this suspended space, would have to return to the world where she was a paid companion, and he was a duke, and the gulf between them was supposed to be unbridgeable. But for now, in this moment, they were simply Sebastian and Georgiana, two people who had found in each other something they had both stopped believing existed: genuine recognition, true seeing, the possibility of connection that went beyond duty or necessity into something far more dangerous and infinitely more precious. Dawn crept through the fog around 5:30 in the morning, grey light seeping through the tall windows like water through cracks, and Sebastian rose from the window seat where they had spent the night in conversation, pacing to the terrace doors as though he needed distance to think clearly, and Georgiana watched him go with her heart sinking, because she understood that their strange suspended night was ending, and soon they would have to return to being who society said they were, rather than who they had discovered themselves to be in the darkness. The candles had burned to stubs, smoking slightly as morning light rendered them unnecessary, and she could see his face clearly now in the grey pre-dawn illumination, the exhaustion that came from staying awake all night written in the shadows under his eyes, his evening clothes rumpled, and his cravat hanging loose in a way that would have scandalized anyone who understood just how much informality that represented for a man of his rank. She began to gather herself, smoothing her hair which had come loose from its pins during the long hours, preparing mentally to return to being invisible, to slip back into the role of paid companion as though this night had never happened. And she was grateful that she had at least these hours to remember, this one night when someone had truly seen her, even if it could never be repeated. "In a few hours London will wake," Sebastian said without turning from the window, his voice tight with something she could not quite identify. "Servants will talk. Someone will have noticed my return, your absence from the dowager's carriage, your reputation." She stood then, brushing down her grey silk skirts with hands that wanted to tremble, but which she forced to steadiness through sheer will, and she spoke with as much calm as she could manufacture, though her throat felt tight. "Will survive as I always survive," she said. "Thank you, Sebastian, for your kindness tonight. I shall never forget." He turned sharply at that, his expression intense in the growing light, and she saw something in his face that made her breath catch. "Kindness," he said, and there was an edge to his voice that had not been there during their hours of conversation. "You think this was kindness?" She stared at him in confusion, uncertain what he meant, what else it could possibly be. "What else would?" she began, but he was already moving, crossing back to her in 3 long strides that ate up the distance between them, and before she could step back or gather her thoughts, he had taken her hands in his grip firm and warm and slightly trembling. "I did not come back for my mother's fan," he said, the words tumbling out rapidly as though he feared silence would steal his courage. "There was no fan. I came back because I could not bear the thought of not speaking with you again, because that waltz was the first time in a decade I have felt truly alive, because every word you have spoken tonight has proven what I suspected the moment I saw you sitting alone watching everyone else with those extraordinarily perceptive eyes." Georgiana felt the world tilt slightly, felt her heart begin to pound so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it, and she forced herself to speak, though her voice came out barely above. A whisper. "Suspected what?" she asked, though part of her was terrified to hear the answer, terrified to hope because hope had proven so dangerous in the past. Sebastian's hands tightened on hers, and she saw in his face a vulnerability that matched her own, the aristocratic control he usually maintained cracking, to reveal something raw and honest beneath. "That you are the woman I have been waiting for without knowing I was waiting," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That intelligence and kindness and honesty and courage in the face of hardship, these are what I value. Not fortune or empty beauty or prestigious family connections. Georgiana, I know this is mad. We have known each other barely 12 hours. She pulled her hands free then, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to protect herself, needed to create distance before he said something that would make the inevitable return to reality even more painful. Please do not, she said, her own voice breaking despite her efforts to control it. Do not offer me charity disguised as— But he cut her off, reaching for her hands again with an urgency that would not be denied. This is not charity, he said fiercely. This is me, at dawn, after the most honest night of my life, asking the woman who sees me clearly to marry me, not to save your reputation. Though that matters, not out of duty, though I would honor that, but because I want you beside me, in my home, in my life, in my bed. I want to hear your thoughts on Wordsworth over breakfast. I want to debate philosophy with you at midnight. I want. He stopped, seeming to struggle for words adequate to what he was trying to express, and Georgiana felt tears begin to fall silently down her face as the impossible hope she had been fighting all night broke through her defenses. Sebastian. I have nothing, she said, trying to make him understand the reality of what he was suggesting. No dowry, no family, no. But he released one of her hands to cup her face, his thumb brushing away tears that would not stop falling. You have everything that matters, he said, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and cherished. You have yourself. And that is all I want. Marry me, Georgiana. Choose me as I am choosing you, not the Duke, but Sebastian, the man who spent the night falling in love with your mind and your spirit and your extraordinary courage. The words hung between them in the grey dawn light, and Georgiana searched his face, looking for any sign that this was some cruel joke or misguided chivalry or anything other than what it appeared to be. Genuine feeling honestly expressed, and what she saw there made her knees weak. You cannot possibly mean this, she said, her voice shaking, when the sun rises fully, when you return to your world. Our world, he interrupted fiercely. If you will have me, I have never been more certain of anything. Marry me. The sounds of London waking penetrated the ballroom. Distant cartwheels, on cobblestones and the first stirrings of servants in the house below, and Georgiana felt the strange, exhausted clarity that came from staying awake all night, that sense of being suspended between sleeping and waking, where everything seemed both more vivid and less real. She looked at Sebastian standing before her in his rumpled evening clothes, his hair disordered from running his hands through it during their long conversation, his face showing every emotion he felt without the mask he usually wore in society. And she realized that she was seeing the real man beneath the title, the person he had revealed to her piece by piece through the night. She thought of the 6 years she had spent making herself invisible, the careful control she had maintained over every word and gesture and expression. The loneliness that had become so familiar, she had stopped noticing it, except in moments like their waltz when she had been briefly reminded what connection felt like, and she understood that he was offering her not just marriage, but visibility, not just security, but partnership, not just duty, but genuine regard. But the risk, she started to say, because even in this moment of overwhelming emotion her practical nature asserted itself. She understood what marrying her would cost him, in terms of society's approval, the scandal that would attach to a duke who chose a penniless companion over the eligible daughters of noble houses. He seemed to read her thoughts in her face because he smiled, a slight crooked smile that made him look younger and more vulnerable. I know the risks, he said quietly. I know what society will say, what my friends will think, the scandal that will follow us both. But Georgiana, I have spent my entire life doing what was expected, marrying the right woman to produce the right heirs to carry on the right bloodlines. And I am tired, so desperately tired of performing a role that has nothing to do with who I actually am. She felt something break open in her chest at his words, the careful walls she had built around her heart crumbling, because how could she maintain them when he was offering her everything she had stopped letting herself want? "But what if you regret it?" she whispered. "What if when the novelty wears off and you return to your life, you realize you have bound yourself to someone society despises? What if—" He pulled her closer then, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and brandy and something uniquely him. "Then we will face that together," he said. "But I do not believe it will happen. I do not believe that what I feel for you is novelty that will fade. I believe it is recognition, the sense of finding someone who matches me in ways I did not know I needed matching." Georgiana's hands, which had been hovering uncertainly between them, reached up of their own accord to touch his face, her fingers trembling as they traced the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheek, and she saw his eyes close at her touch, saw him lean into her palm with a small sound that might have been relief or need or both. "I am terrified," she admitted, because honesty seemed to be the currency of whatever was happening between them, terrified that this is a dream I will wake from, terrified that I will fail you, terrified that I do not know how to be what you need. His eyes opened, and she saw in them a warmth that made her breath catch. "You are already what I need," he said simply. "You are yourself, honest and intelligent and kind and strong. And if you can find it in yourself to take a risk on me, on us, then I promise you I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never regret it." The terrace doors showed the garden emerging from darkness, roses and hedges taking shape as grey light strengthened toward true dawn, and Georgiana understood that they were standing at a threshold, that her answer would determine the entire course of her future, that she could retreat to safety, to the known misery of her current existence, or she could step forward into complete uncertainty with this man who had somehow seen past all her defenses to the person she kept hidden. She thought of her father who had taught her to value truth over comfort, who had raised her to think for herself even when it was inconvenient, and she thought of what he would say if he could see her now, and she knew with sudden clarity that he would tell her to be brave, to choose connection over safety, to risk heartbreak rather than guarantee loneliness. "Yes," she said, and the word came out stronger than she expected. "Yes, Sebastian, I will marry you. I will take this terrifying, impossible risk because you are right. We see each other truly, and that is so rare, I would be a fool to turn away from it out of fear." She saw the transformation in his face, the way relief and joy and something deeper flooded his features, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her against him with a fierceness that spoke of how uncertain he had been of her answer, despite his confident words. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other while dawn broke fully over London, the fog finally lifting to reveal a city waking to a new day, and Georgiana felt something settle in her chest, some piece of herself she had not known was missing clicking into place. When Sebastian finally pulled back enough to look at her face, she saw tears in his own eyes to match hers, and he smiled with such unguarded happiness that she could not help but smile back. "We are going to scandalize everyone," she said, and there was wonder in her voice rather than fear. "They will say terrible things about both of us." "Let them," he said, his hands coming up to frame her face. "Let them say what they will. We will know the truth, that I chose you not out of duty or pity, but because you are the only woman I have ever met who makes me want to be more than my title, who sees Sebastian rather than the Duke of Ashford." She turned her face to press a kiss to his palm, a gesture of tenderness that felt simultaneously natural and shocking in its intimacy, and she felt him shudder slightly at the contact. "I love you," she said, the words surprising her because she had not meant to say them aloud, had not even fully acknowledged them to herself. But they were true, she realized. True in a way that defied the shortness of their acquaintance. I think I began falling in love with you during the waltz when you quoted Wordsworth and looked at me as though my opinion mattered. Sebastian's smile widened, and he bent his head until his forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. I love you too, he said, and I suspect I have been falling since the moment I saw you sitting alone, so still and self-contained, while everyone else performed for each other. There was something about you that called to me, even before we spoke. The ballroom around them was fully visible now in morning light, the grandeur that darkness had softened now harsh and clear, but Georgiana found she did not care, found that the magic of the night had not dissipated with dawn, but had instead transformed into something more solid, a foundation on which they might build something real. We should leave, Sebastian said reluctantly. Before the household fully wakes, I will take you to my sister Henrietta. She is a widow of independent mind, and will provide proper chaperonage until we can be married. Georgiana nodded, understanding the practicalities even as part of her wanted to remain in this ballroom forever, suspended in the moment of their choosing each other. But she was also eager now to begin whatever came next, to step forward into the uncertain future with this man who had somehow become essential to her in the space of one impossible night. They left the Tilney ballroom as dawn broke fully over London, Sebastian's hand steady at Georgiana's elbow as he guided her through the waking household and into his waiting carriage, and she was grateful for his presence because she felt herself trembling with exhaustion and the overwhelming reality of what they had just promised each other, the future suddenly vast and terrifying in a way it had not been when contained within the intimacy of candlelight and conversation. He took her directly to his sister's townhouse in Bloomsbury, a handsome brick building with ivy climbing the facade and warm light already glowing in the windows. And when Henrietta Dashwood opened the door herself, still in her dressing gown with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, she took one look at Georgiana's rumpled grey dress and Sebastian's exhausted face and ushered them both inside without a single question, though her eyes held sharp intelligence that suggested she understood far more than they had said. Within an hour, Georgiana found herself installed in a guest bedroom decorated in shades of cream and rose, wearing one of Henrietta's nightgowns and being urged to sleep while Sebastian spoke privately with his sister. But sleep proved impossible because her mind would not stop replaying the night's events. Sebastian's proposal, her acceptance, the enormity of what she had agreed to, and she lay staring at the ceiling, feeling hope and terror war within her chest. When she finally emerged from the bedroom late that afternoon, drawn by the smell of tea and the low murmur of voices, she found Henrietta alone in the drawing-room, a space so different from the formal receiving rooms Georgiana had seen in other houses, books stacked on every surface and paintings leaning against walls as though their owner could not decide where to hang them, comfortable chairs arranged for conversation rather than display, and the widow looked up from her reading with a smile that held both warmth and something shrewd. "My brother has told me everything," Henrietta said without preamble, pouring tea with steady hands, "and I want you to know that you have my complete support. Sebastian has been half dead for years, going through the motions of his life without any real engagement, and in the few hours I spoke with him this morning I saw more animation, more genuine feeling than I have seen since our mother died." Georgiana accepted the teacup, her own hands not quite as steady, and she found herself studying this woman who would be her sister if the marriage actually took place. Henrietta was perhaps 35, handsome rather than beautiful, with direct grey eyes and an air of independence that suggested she cared very little for society's opinions. But within hours the first whispers began to spread through London like fire through dry grass. Servants talked to other servants. The Tilney household staff reported that the Duke had returned in the early morning hours and had been seen leaving with a woman in grey, and by nightfall the drawing rooms and clubs buzzed with speculation about what had transpired during those unaccounted hours. The Dowager Countess sent her dismissal letter the next morning, the heavy cream paper arriving by special messenger, and Georgiana read it with shaking hands, while Henrietta sat beside her radiating fury at every coldly proper word. The letter dripped with moral outrage, thinly disguised as concern, suggesting that Georgiana had deliberately engineered her abandonment to trap a duke, that her behaviour had been calculating and shameful, that the Dowager could not possibly retain in her employment someone who had so thoroughly compromised herself and brought scandal upon the household, and the final line, written in the old woman's spidery hand, informed Georgiana that no reference would be provided, and that her few possessions would be sent to wherever she chose to receive them. Georgiana set the letter down carefully, fighting the urge to crumple it or throw it across the room, and she felt the weight of what she had done settle more heavily on her shoulders because without a reference she could never work as a companion again. Her entire means of supporting herself had been destroyed in a single night, and if Sebastian changed his mind, if he decided upon reflection that marrying her was too high a price to pay for one night of honest conversation, she would be utterly ruined with no way to recover. Henrietta took the letter from her nerveless fingers and read it with an expression of deepening disgust. "The woman is a hypocrite," she said flatly. "She brought you to that ball knowing full well that your position made you vulnerable to exactly this kind of situation, and now she abandons you to save her own reputation, as though moral superiority could be purchased by casting off anyone touched by scandal." The words were meant to comfort, but Georgiana could not quite accept them because part of her wondered if the Dowager was right, if she had been unconsciously hoping for something when she accepted Sebastian's invitation to waltz, if her situation was somehow her own fault for not being more careful, more guarded, more realistic about her place in the world. Society's verdict came swiftly and harshly. Matrons who had never spoken to Georgiana suddenly had passionate opinions about her character, declaring that Sebastian had been trapped by a scheming companion who had deliberately arranged to be compromised, that it was a tale as old as time, penniless women using their wiles to ensnare wealthy men, and the fact that Sebastian was a duke only made the scandal more delicious to those who fed on such things. Georgiana heard the whispers second-hand through Henrietta, who attended a tea party specifically to gauge the temperature of society's response, and she came back pale with anger, reporting that women who had never done a day's useful work in their lives were condemning Georgiana's character while simultaneously envying her success in capturing such an eligible prize. Sebastian weathered the first storm of gossip with apparent calm, continuing his parliamentary duties and social obligations as though nothing had changed. But Henrietta told Georgiana that her brother was privately struggling with a fury he rarely allowed himself to express, anger at the cruelty and hypocrisy of people he had considered friends, rage at a system that valued bloodlines over character and condemned genuine feeling as weakness. 3 days after their night in the ballroom, Edmund Bennet, Earl of Worthing and Sebastian's closest friend since their school days, came to call, and Georgiana retreated to her borrowed bedroom while the two men closeted themselves in Sebastian's study. But the house was quiet enough that she could hear raised voices even through the closed doors, Edmund's reasonable baritone suggesting solutions that made her stomach clench with dread, and Sebastian's responses growing colder and harder as the conversation progressed. She learned the details later from Sebastian himself, who came to find her in Henrietta's drawing room with his face set in lines of barely controlled anger, and he told her without preamble what Edmund had proposed, that Sebastian should pay Georgiana off generously, set her up in a quiet cottage somewhere far from London, let the scandal die down, and then marry someone appropriate to his station. "Sebastian, be reasonable," Edmund had said. according to Sebastian's bitter recounting. "The girl is a nobody, a paid companion. Yes, you were alone together, but these things can be managed discreetly. A generous settlement, a quiet cottage somewhere." And Sebastian had interrupted him with ice in his voice. "Her name is Georgiana, and you will speak of her with respect or leave my house." But Edmund had persisted, genuinely concerned, according to Sebastian, though Georgiana suspected the concern was less for them and more for how their scandal reflected on their entire social circle. "For God's sake, you cannot seriously intend to marry her," Edmund had said. "The scandal." And Sebastian had cut him off with words that made Georgiana's eyes sting with tears when he repeated them. "The scandal is that society values empty bloodlines over character," Sebastian had said, his voice shaking with the force of his conviction that a woman of Georgiana's intelligence and dignity has been forced to live as a shadow because her father's investments failed, that I am expected to marry some vapid debutante whose greatest accomplishment is playing mediocre piano rather than a woman I can actually converse with. Edmund had tried one more time, warning that Sebastian would be ostracized, that his position in Parliament and his influence would suffer, and Sebastian's response had been final. "Will survive or will not," he had said, "but I will not sacrifice the first genuine happiness I have found in a decade to preserve the good opinion of people I do not respect." Georgiana listened to Sebastian's account, sitting very still in her borrowed dress of deep blue silk that Henrietta had altered to fit her, and she felt something crack open in her chest because he had defended her, had risked a friendship of decades, standing rather than abandon her to the easier path, and she reached for his hand across the small table between them. "You have lost a friend," she said quietly, "because of me." "No," Sebastian corrected, his hand closing warm and firm around hers. "I have discovered who my true friends are. There is a difference. Henrietta has been magnificent, and several of the reform-minded peers have sent private messages of support, people with actual principles rather than just prejudices." That evening Sebastian insisted they attend the opera, a deliberately public appearance designed to make clear his intentions, and Georgiana dressed in another of Henrietta's gowns, deep blue silk that fit well enough, though it had clearly been made for someone slightly taller, and she looked at herself in the mirror, seeing a stranger, a woman on the verge of becoming a duchess, if she could just survive the scrutiny and condemnation that awaited. The carriage ride to the Royal Opera House passed in tense silence, Henrietta beside Georgiana offering wordless support through her presence, Sebastian across from them with his face set in aristocratic lines that revealed nothing of what he felt. And when they alighted before the grand entrance, Georgiana felt hundreds of eyes turn toward them, the whispers starting immediately as people recognized the Duke, and realized the woman on his arm must be the notorious companion. The opera house blazed with light, every chandelier lit, and every box filled with London's elite dressed in silks and jewels. And Georgiana walked beside Sebastian with her head high and her hand steady on his arm, though inside she felt herself shaking with terror at the magnitude of what they were doing. They climbed the stairs to Sebastian's box, one of the finest in the theatre, with a perfect view of both stage and audience, and Henrietta arranged herself beside Georgiana in a deliberate statement of respectability and support, while Sebastian took the seat that would make him most visible to the rest of the theatre. The hush when they entered was palpable, conversation dying in waves as opera glasses turned toward their box, and Georgiana felt the weight of all those eyes like a physical pressure. Hundreds of people staring and judging and whispering behind their programs and fans. She forced herself to sit calmly, to arrange her skirts and open her program as though she attended the opera every week, as though she could not feel the intense scrutiny or hear the rustling whispers that filled the theatre like the sound of restless birds. The stage remained empty, the performance not yet begun, and Georgiana realized with a sick feeling that no one was looking at the stage anymore, that the real drama was unfolding in their box, and she wanted desperately to flee, but Sebastian's hand found hers in the shadows between their seats, his grip warm and steadying. Then he stood, the movement sudden enough to draw every eye in the theatre if they were not already staring, and Georgiana's breath caught because she had no idea what he intended. But she knew from the set of his shoulders that it would be dramatic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sebastian said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed theatre without him having to shout. "Trained projection from years of speaking in Parliament, I believe introductions are in order. Miss Georgiana Fairfax has done me the extraordinary honour of accepting my proposal of marriage. The banns will be read this Sunday. I anticipate your felicitations." The silence that followed was absolute, hundreds of people frozen in stunned shock, and Georgiana felt the world tilt slightly, because he had just publicly claimed her, had announced their engagement before all of London society in a way that made retreat impossible for either of them. "Sebastian, you do not have to," she whispered, but he was already turning to her, taking her hand in both of his and speaking to her but loudly enough that the nearby boxes could hear every word. "Yes, I do," he said, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made everything else fade, "because you deserve to be acknowledged publicly and proudly, not hidden away like some shameful secret. You are going to be the Duchess of Ashford, and every person in this theatre will treat you with the respect that position commands." Georgiana felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely, refusing to cry in front of this audience that wanted nothing more than to see her break, and she squeezed Sebastian's hand hard enough that it must have hurt. The theatre remained silent for another long moment, the tension stretching until it felt ready to snap, and then, somewhere in the upper galleries, someone began to applaud. Slowly at first, and then with more enthusiasm, and others joined in. Not everyone, not even half, but enough that the sound filled the space and gave permission for those who were uncertain to follow. Sebastian sat back down beside her, keeping her hand in his, and Henrietta leaned over to whisper something fierce and approving that Georgiana could not quite hear over the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The opera began finally, singers taking the stage to perform Donizetti, though Georgiana could not have said later what the production was about, because she was too aware of the continued scrutiny. The opera glasses still turned more often toward their box than toward the stage, but Sebastian sat beside her, apparently absorbed in the music, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm in a gesture of reassurance that no one else could see. During the interval, several people came to their box, some offering genuine congratulations with warmth in their eyes, others clearly motivated by curiosity or the desire to report back to their circles what the notorious companion looked like up close, and Georgiana endured it all with as much grace as she could muster, answering questions about where she was from and how she and Sebastian had met, with carefully neutral responses that revealed nothing of their night together. One elderly duchess, a woman with steel-grey hair and eyes like chips of ice, looked Georgiana up and down with an expression of open disdain before turning to Sebastian. "I hope you know what you are doing," she said, her voice carrying to the nearby boxes. "Your father would be appalled." "My father was appalled by everything that brought joy," Sebastian replied evenly, "which is why I have no intention of living my life according to his dictates. Now, if you will excuse us—" "Your Grace, my fiancé and I would like to enjoy the second act." The Duchess swept away in a rustle of purple silk, and Henrietta laughed quietly. "Well handled," she murmured. "Father would indeed be appalled, which is the strongest argument I have heard yet for this marriage." By the end of the evening, Georgiana felt wrung out, exhausted by the effort of maintaining her composure under such intense examination. But she also felt something unexpected, a fierce pride in Sebastian's public declaration, in his willingness to stand beside her despite the cost, and when they returned to Henrietta's townhouse, she found herself clinging to his hand, unwilling to let him leave, even though propriety demanded he return to his own residence. "We survived," she said softly, standing with him in Henrietta's front hall, while his sister discreetly disappeared upstairs. "We survived, and you did not waver." "I will never waver," Sebastian said, pulling her close and pressing a kiss to her forehead that felt like a vow. "We are in this together, Georgiana. Whatever comes next, we face it side by side." Georgiana woke on her wedding morning in Henrietta's guest room, with sunlight streaming through the windows and a surprising sense of calm settling over her like a blessing. The 3 weeks since Sebastian's public declaration at the opera having passed in a blur of preparations and continued scandal, and the gradual realization that she was actually going to marry him, that this was not some fever dream born of exhaustion and brandy, but reality unfolding with inexorable momentum toward this November day. She rose and bathed with Henrietta's help, the widow having appointed herself lady's maid and confidant and fierce protector all in one, and together they dressed Georgiana in a gown of ivory silk, simple and elegant rather than the elaborate confection a ducal bride would traditionally wear, but it suited her perfectly with its clean lines and modest lace trim at the collar. And cuffs, and when she looked at herself in the mirror she saw not a paid companion trying to hide, but a woman claiming her own happiness with quiet confidence. The ceremony was to be at St. George's Chapel, a compromise between Sebastian's desire for complete privacy and the necessity of making their marriage legally and socially legitimate. And when the carriage arrived to take them through the London streets, Georgiana felt her calm waver slightly, because this was the final threshold, the last moment when she could theoretically retreat to safety. And then Henrietta squeezed her hand and murmured something about how her own wedding had terrified her, but she had never regretted choosing love over security. And Georgiana steadied herself with the reminder that Sebastian had already proven his commitment in the most public way possible. The chapel was intimate rather than grand, morning light streaming through stained glass windows to create rainbow patterns on the stone floor, and the gathering was small, perhaps 30 people where a duke's wedding would normally draw hundreds, many of society's elite having refused to attend in a final gesture of disapproval that no longer had the power to wound Georgiana as it might have weeks earlier. But those who were present were genuine well-wishers, Henrietta, of course, in the front pew already crying happy tears, and to Georgiana's surprise, Edmund Bennet was there as well, the Earl having sent Sebastian a letter of apology 2 weeks prior, admitting he had been wrong to suggest anything other than marriage, that his concern had been rooted in fear rather than friendship, and that he hoped to be forgiven for his failure to see what Sebastian had seen from the first. There were several reform-minded peers as well, men who had worked with Sebastian in Parliament on education initiatives, and who seemed to view his unconventional marriage as further evidence of his principled nature rather than a scandal to be condemned, and their presence lent a respectability to the proceedings that Georgiana appreciated, even as she tried to convince herself that she did not care what anyone thought. Sebastian waited at the altar, his tall frame rigid with tension until the moment he turned and saw her, and Georgiana watched his expression transform from anxiety to wonder, to such unguarded joy that she felt tears prick her own eyes, and suddenly the walk down the aisle seemed impossibly long because she wanted nothing more than to be beside him, to take his hand and speak the vows that would bind them together in the eyes of God and law and society. When she finally reached him, he took her hand in both of his grip warm and slightly trembling, and she realized that he had been as nervous as she was, that for all his aristocratic confidence, he had feared she might change her mind at the last moment, and she squeezed his fingers hard to reassure him that she was here, that she was certain, that nothing would make her turn back now. The vicar began the ceremony, his voice solemn in the quiet chapel. And when it came time for the vows, Georgiana spoke with her eyes never leaving Sebastian's face, her voice steady and clear as she promised to have and to hold him from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death parted them. Sebastian's voice was rougher when he spoke the same words, emotion making it shake slightly on the phrase to love and to cherish, and she saw tears in his eyes to match her own. Both of them fully aware of the weight of what they were promising, the life they were choosing together despite all the obstacles society had placed in their path. When the vicar finally pronounced them man and wife, Sebastian bent to kiss her with a tenderness that stole her breath, and he whispered against her lips so quietly that only she could hear, "Finally, mine." And she smiled as she corrected him. Ours, because that was the truth of it. They belonged to each other now in a partnership of equals, choosing each other daily. The wedding breakfast was held at Sebastian's townhouse in Mayfair, Georgiana's first time entering the grand building that would now be her home, and she was struck by how different it felt from the cold, formal spaces she had visited as a companion, because Sebastian had directed the staff to arrange everything for comfort rather than display, small tables where guests could actually converse rather than long, formal arrangements that prevented real connection, and the food was excellent but not ostentatious, and the whole atmosphere suggested celebration rather than obligation. Edmund approached her during the breakfast, his handsome face showing genuine contrition, and he bowed over her hand with a formality that seemed designed to acknowledge his previous discourtesy. "Your Grace," he said, using her new title with careful emphasis, "I owe you an apology for my words to Sebastian. I allowed prejudice to override judgment, and I spoke of you in ways that were both unkind and inaccurate. I hope you can forgive me." Georgiana studied him for a moment, seeing in his eyes that the apology was sincere, and she found that she could not hold anger against someone who had at least the grace to admit when he was wrong. "You spoke from concern for your friend," she said quietly. "I cannot fault that, even if I disagreed with your conclusions. Let us begin again, Lord Worthing, as allies rather than adversaries." His relief was palpable, and when Sebastian joined them a few minutes later, the three fell into easy conversation about parliamentary business, and Georgiana discovered that Edmund was actually quite intelligent when he stopped posturing, and she began to understand why Sebastian valued his friendship despite their recent conflict. The weeks that followed the wedding passed in a haze of adjustment, Georgiana learning to navigate her new role as Duchess of Ashford, while Sebastian supported her with a patience that never failed to move her, and gradually the scandal that had seemed so overwhelming began to fade as London society found new dramas to occupy their attention. 18 months later, Georgiana sat at her writing desk in the Duchess's apartments, a suite of rooms she had redecorated in warm colours that felt nothing like the cold formality of typical aristocratic spaces. Books and writing materials scattered across every surface in comfortable disorder. And she was composing yet another letter to Parliament about the working conditions of governesses and companions, her advocacy work having become as much a passion as her marriage. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, warming the room, and she was so absorbed in finding exactly the right words to convey the urgency of the situation without alienating potential supporters that she did not hear Sebastian enter until he spoke over her shoulder. "You will make enemies with this, you know," he said, his voice holding affectionate amusement. "The employment agencies profit from companions' desperation." Georgiana looked up at him, this man who had transformed her life simply by seeing her truly, and she smiled with a fierceness that still sometimes surprised her. "Then I will make enemies," she said. "I have a duke's protection. Now, I would be a coward not to use it for good." Sebastian bent to kiss her temple, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder in a gesture of casual intimacy that spoke of long familiarity. "This is why I love you," he murmured, that spine of steel hidden beneath grace and courtesy. She leaned back against him, tilting her head to meet his eyes. "You created this monster," she pointed out. "If you had married some biddable debutante, she would be embroidering cushions, not agitating for reform." "Thank God I had the sense to fall in love with you instead," Sebastian said, and his hand moved from her shoulder to rest gently on the barely visible curve of her belly, the child they had not yet announced publicly, but which filled them both with a joy tempered by appropriate caution, given that she was only 4 months along. The season's opening ball came in May, a glittering affair at the Pemberton townhouse, ironically enough, the same family whose annual ball had been the site of Georgiana's abandonment nearly 2 years prior, and she dressed with Henrietta's help in a gown of deep crimson silk that would have been unthinkable when she was a companion, the Ashford emeralds at her throat and in her ears, jewels that had belonged to Sebastian's mother, and which he had presented to her on their wedding night, with hands that shook slightly as he fastened the necklace. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman transformed, no longer hiding in grey, but claiming her space in the world with confidence born of being truly seen and valued. And when Sebastian came to escort her downstairs, his expression made clear that he saw the transformation too, and approved wholeheartedly. The ballroom was ablaze with light when they entered, hundreds of candles in crystal chandeliers creating a glow that rivaled daylight. And Georgiana felt eyes turn toward them, but the quality of the attention had shifted over the months, no longer the cruel judgment of that first opera appearance, but something closer to curiosity, mixed with grudging respect. The whispers she overheard as they made their way through the crush were admiring rather than condemning. "She has quite transformed," one matron murmured to another. "And they do seem genuinely devoted, which is more than can be said for most society marriages." Sebastian led her onto the dance floor for the opening waltz, the orchestra striking up the same melody that had been playing that night so long ago when everything changed, and as he took her in his arms with the easy familiarity of long practice, she felt herself smile at the symmetry of it. "Do you remember?" she said as they began to move. "A year and a half ago I sat in a ballroom not unlike this one, convinced I was invisible." "Impossible," Sebastian said, pulling her closer than strict propriety allowed, but no one would dare criticize a duke's public affection for his wife. "I saw you the moment you entered." "You saw me when no one else did," Georgiana said softly. "That changes a parser." "Woman, Sebastian, being truly seen." "Being truly seen changes a man as well," he replied, his eyes holding hers with the same intensity he had shown in the darkness of the Tilney ballroom. "I was sleepwalking through life until that night." "Our night of scandal," Georgiana said, unable to suppress a smile at the memory of how terrified she had been, how certain that discovery would mean her ruin. "Our night of transformation," Sebastian corrected. "Best night of my life." "Mine too," she agreed, "though I am rather glad we have a proper bed now instead of a window seat." Sebastian laughed, the sound rich and unguarded in a way that made several nearby couples turn to look, and Georgiana realized with a start that they were scandalizing people again, but this time with happiness rather than impropriety. "Georgiana," he said with mock severity, "such talk from a duchess." "You knew what you were getting when you proposed in the darkness," she reminded him, too late for regrets now. His expression softened, all teasing gone, replaced by a tenderness that still had the power to make her breath catch. "No regrets," he said firmly. "Not one. Not ever." They danced in comfortable silence for a few moments, moving together with the unconscious synchronization of long partnership. And Georgiana looked around the ballroom, seeing it with different eyes than she had possessed that night of her abandonment. Young debutantes watched them as they waltzed past, and she saw in some faces not envy of her title or jewels, but something deeper, a longing for the obvious connection she and Sebastian shared, the way they looked at each other as though no one else in the room mattered. And she realized that they had become something of a symbol, proof that marriages could be based on genuine regard rather than mere social arrangement. Edmund approached them when the waltz ended, offering his arm to Georgiana with a gallantry that suggested their reconciliation was complete. "May I have the honor of the next dance?" "Your Grace," he asked, "I promise not to step on your toes or offer any ill-advised counsel." Georgiana laughed and accepted, glancing at Sebastian, who nodded his approval, and as Edmund led her back onto the floor, she found herself grateful for this too. The friendship that had been tested and had survived. The gradual building of a circle of people who valued them for themselves rather than their positions. The evening wore on with Georgiana dancing with various partners, including several of the reform-minded peers who wanted to discuss her companion advocacy work and seemed genuinely interested in her proposals, and she realized with a sense of wonder that she had somehow acquired influence of her own, that people listened to her not just because she was the Duchess of Ashford, but because her ideas had merit and her passion was convincing. Henrietta found her near midnight, pressing a glass of lemonade into her hand, with a knowing look at Georgiana's barely visible condition. "You should rest," she said quietly. "You have been on your feet for hours." "I am well," Georgiana assured her, but she was grateful for the excuse to retreat to a quiet corner where she could observe rather than participate. And from that vantage point, she watched Sebastian across the room, deep in conversation with several parliamentary colleagues, his face animated in a way it never had been before their marriage, and she knew that their partnership had transformed him as much as it had transformed her. He had found renewed purpose in his political work, supporting education reforms and arguing for measures that would give women more legal protections. And his colleagues respected him not despite his unconventional marriage, but in some ways because of it, seeing in his willingness to defy convention for principle a quality that translated to his legislative efforts. Near 1 in the morning, Sebastian came to collect her, offering his arm and his warmest smile. "Shall we go home?" he asked, and the word home had never sounded sweeter, because it meant the townhouse where they had built a life together, where his coat would be draped over a chair in her study, and her book would sit beside his on the table, where they would climb the stairs together and fall into bed to make love with the easy passion of couples who knew each other's bodies as well as their minds. They made their farewells and stepped out into the cool May night, the carriage waiting to take them the short distance back to Mayfair, and as Sebastian handed her in, Georgiana looked back at the blazing windows of the Pemberton townhouse and thought about how much had changed since that November night when she had sat abandoned and invisible in a darkening ballroom. She had been transformed, but not in the way society measured such things, not from poverty to wealth or obscurity to prominence, but from invisibility to being seen, from isolation to partnership, from surviving to truly living. And as the carriage pulled away and Sebastian drew her close against his side, she rested her hand on the small swell of her belly and thought about the future they were building together, the child who would grow up seeing a marriage of equals who chose each other daily, who would learn that worth came from character rather than circumstance, and she felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with being known and loved for exactly who she was. The streets of London rolled past the carriage windows, fog beginning to gather in the low places as it had that night so long ago, and Sebastian pressed a kiss to her hair, murmuring something about how he loved her, how she had saved him as much as he had saved her, and Georgiana smiled into the darkness, knowing it was true, knowing that they had rescued each other from the half-lives they had been living, that their night of abandonment had become the foundation for a love that grew stronger with each passing day. And when they finally arrived home and climbed the stairs together hand in hand, she looked back one more time at the night that had brought them together and whispered a silent thanks to whatever providence had orchestrated her abandonment in that ballroom, because without it she would never have discovered that being seen, truly seen, was the greatest gift one person could give another, and that love built on genuine recognition was worth any scandal, any sacrifice, any risk, because it transformed not just circumstances but souls, making visible what had been hidden, bringing light to what had been darkness, and creating from two lonely people a partnership that would endure long after society's whispers had faded into memory.